23 years. That's how long Judge Thaddeus Wellington had been married before he found his wife's profile on a lesbian dating website. Searching for love with other women, he'd given her everything: his name, his reputation, his heart, a mansion in Cleveland Heights, built a life that looked perfect from the outside. And this is what she'd been doing in secret. That night, in a rage he couldn't control, Thaddeus made a decision that would cost him everything he'd ever worked for. But what if that profile wasn't what it seemed? What if his wife had been trying to tell him the truth and he'd destroyed her before she got the chance? Even more, what if the real tragedy wasn't the betrayal, but the fact that neither of them knew how to be honest when honesty mattered most? And will Thaddeus understand what he's done before it's too late? Or will he destroy the woman he claims to love, simply because she had the courage to face a truth he couldn't handle? This is the story of a marriage built on unspoken wounds, a woman suffocating under the weight of who everyone expected her to be, and a judge who'd spent his life sentencing others until he became judge, jury, and executioner in his own home. And when you finally understand what really happened that December night, you'll realize that the most dangerous thing in any relationship isn't infidelity or lies. It's the truth we're too afraid to speak, and the rage that fills the silence when someone finally does. Welcome back to Crime Radio, where we go deep into the darkest corners of human nature. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Thaddeus Wellington was born on April 15, 1968, in the Glenville neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, when the city still carried the industrial muscle of America's heartland. He came into the world during a spring snowstorm, his mother liked to say, as if even nature recognized something different about her boy. His father, Thaddeus Wellington Sr., worked as a foreman at Republic Steel, one of the few black men to achieve such a position in those fractious times. His mother, Dorothy Wellington, taught 5th grade at Kennard Elementary, where she was beloved for her firm hand and generous heart. Thaddeus grew up in a household where education was religion, and excellence was the only acceptable offering. The Wellington home on East 105th Street was filled with books: James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, legal texts his father studied at night, hoping to become more than what the steel mills would allow. Young Thaddeus absorbed it all, understanding early that his path out of Glenville would be paved with discipline, intelligence, and an unshakable commitment to proving himself in rooms that didn't expect him. He graduated summa cum laude from Howard University in 1990, then earned his JD from Yale Law School in 1993, where he was one of only 12 black students in his class. The isolation taught him to armor himself in competence, to speak in measured tones that disarmed prejudice, to become unimpeachable. By 35, he was the youngest black judge appointed to the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. By 42, he sat on the appeals court. His reputation was sterling. Fair but firm, erudite but approachable, a man who believed the law was the highest form of civilization's promise. But beneath the robes and the reputation, Thaddeus Wellington carried a wound he'd never fully acknowledged. His father had died of a heart attack when Thaddeus was at Yale, collapsing in the mill during a double shift he'd taken to help pay for his son's textbooks. Thaddeus had been studying for contracts when the call came. He'd missed his father's last words, his last breath, because he was 3 states away, pursuing a dream his father had made possible, but would never see fulfilled. That guilt lived in Thaddeus like a second heart, pumping cold blood through his veins, whispering that he could never do enough, be enough, achieve enough to justify the sacrifice. Diane Wellington was born on June 22, 1970, in Columbus, Ohio, to a middle-class family that prized stability above all else. Her father, Robert Foster, was an accountant with the state government. Her mother, Mary Ann, was a church secretary who measured the world in hymns and propriety. Diane learned early to perform the role expected of her: the dutiful daughter, the accomplished student, the appropriate young woman who never raised her voice or questioned the script. She met Thaddeus at a Howard University alumni mixer in 1995, 2 years after his graduation. He was already making waves as an assistant prosecutor, and she was working as a social worker for Cuyahoga County, helping families navigate the brutal machinery of child protective services. She was drawn to his intensity, his intelligence, the way he spoke about justice as if it were something real and attainable. He was drawn to her grace, her quiet strength, the way she seemed to understand suffering without being consumed by it. They married in 1997 in a ceremony at Antioch Baptist Church that was featured in the Call and Post, Cleveland's black newspaper. She wore her grandmother's pearls. He cried during his vows. They honeymooned in Martha's Vineyard, walking beaches and dreaming of the life they would build. Children, perhaps, a legacy of service, a partnership that would weather anything. But Diane had brought her own wound to the marriage, one she'd never named, even to herself. All through her childhood, she'd felt a distance from her own life, as if she were watching herself from behind glass. The boys she dated never quite reached her. The wedding night with Thaddeus had been tender, but strange, as if she were performing a role from a script written by someone else. Over the years, that distance had grown, and with it, a quiet, aching loneliness she couldn't articulate. She loved Thaddeus, truly loved him, but she'd begun to wonder if love was supposed to feel like standing outside yourself, forever reaching for something just beyond your grasp. They'd built their life in a sprawling Tudor revival in Cleveland Heights, one of the few predominantly black affluent neighborhoods in the city. The house had 6 bedrooms they'd intended to fill with children, but after 3 miscarriages, they'd stopped trying. The empty rooms became shrines to what might have been, and Diane threw herself into her work, eventually becoming the director of the county's foster care system. Thaddeus buried himself in case files and the relentless pursuit of appellate perfection. By December 2015, they'd been married 18 years. To the outside world, they were Cleveland's black power couple, accomplished, respected, the embodiment of what hard work and talent could achieve. They hosted fundraisers, attended gallery openings, mentored young professionals. Their marriage looked like something from a magazine spread. But inside the Tudor revival, in the quiet hours after midnight, they'd become strangers who shared a bed. Cleveland in 2015 carried the weight of its own contradictions. The city that had once been a beacon of industrial prosperity, a place where black families from the South migrated for factory jobs and the promise of something better, had hollowed out after the collapse of steel and manufacturing. The neighborhoods that had thrived in Thaddeus's childhood now bore the scars of disinvestment: boarded-up storefronts, abandoned houses, a school system lurching from one crisis to another. Yet pockets of resilience remained. Cleveland Heights, where the Wellingtons lived, was one such pocket, a neighborhood where black professionals, artists, and academics had created a community that defied the narrative of urban decay. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, a genuine sense of civic pride. It was here that Thaddeus and Diane had tried to plant roots deep enough to sustain them. But the truth about their marriage was more complicated than the facade suggested. The miscarriages had created a fault line between them that neither knew how to bridge. The first had been early, at 8 weeks, explained away as common by a doctor who seemed bored by their grief. The second came at 14 weeks, with cramping so severe Diane thought she was dying. The third, the worst, happened at 20 weeks. Far enough along that they'd seen their daughter on ultrasound, watched her tiny hand wave at the camera, chosen a name, Amara, meaning grace. After Amara, something in Diane had shut down. She went through the motions, returned to work, smiled when expected, made love to Thaddeus when the calendar suggested they should try again. But a part of her had remained in that hospital room, holding a daughter who never took a breath. Thaddeus had processed it differently. He'd thrown himself into his work with renewed ferocity, as if enough convictions, enough justice dispensed, could somehow balance the cosmic ledger. He took on high-profile cases, worked 80-hour weeks, became known as the judge who never showed mercy to child abusers or domestic violence offenders. In the courtroom, he was God. At home, he was a ghost. The distance between them grew measured in small silences. Diane stopped reaching for his hand during movies. Thaddeus stopped asking about her day. They communicated in practicalities: whose turn to pick up groceries, whether to refinish the hardwood floors, what to serve at the upcoming fundraiser. Sex became scheduled, mechanical, another task to complete before sleep. It was in this emotional wasteland that Diane had begun to notice things about herself she'd spent 30 years avoiding. The way her gaze lingered on the barista at the coffee shop, a woman with short natural hair and confident hands. The flutter in her chest when her colleague, Patricia, touched her shoulder during a difficult case review. The dreams she couldn't quite remember, but woke from feeling flushed and guilty. She'd grown up in a church where homosexuality was never discussed, except in whispers and warnings. Her mother had cried when their neighbor Mrs. Henderson's daughter came out, treating it like a death in the family. The message was clear. Some truths were too dangerous to speak, some desires too sinful to acknowledge. But the feelings wouldn't be silenced. They'd grown louder as the marriage grew quieter, until Diane felt like she was suffocating under the weight of what she couldn't say. Thaddeus, for his part, had sensed the distance but misread its source. He assumed Diane blamed him for the miscarriages, though the doctors had said it was nobody's fault. He assumed she resented his career success, while her own work, though vital, went largely unrecognized. He assumed she'd fallen out of love with him the way couples sometimes did, gradually, then completely, like winter settling over Lake Erie. What he never assumed, what he couldn't have imagined, was that his wife was questioning the very foundations of her identity. In the fall of 2015, Diane had attended a conference in Columbus on foster care reform. After a long day of presentations, she'd gone to the hotel bar for a glass of wine. A woman sitting alone at a corner table had caught her eye, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of the book she was reading, Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. They'd started talking. The woman's name was Angela, and she was a social work professor at Ohio State. The conversation flowed like water, easy and natural, touching on everything from systemic racism and child welfare to the pressure Black professional women faced to be perpetually strong. When Angela had mentioned her wife, saying it casually as if it were the most normal thing in the world, Diane had felt something crack open inside her chest. "You're married?" Diane had asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 6 years, Angela said, smiling. "Best decision I ever made. It took me until I was 35 to figure out who I really was. But once I did, everything else fell into place." They'd talked for 3 hours. Nothing inappropriate happened. No touching beyond a goodbye hug, no exchange of phone numbers. But that conversation had planted a seed in Diane's mind. A whisper that maybe the suffocating distance she'd felt her entire life wasn't inevitable. Maybe it was diagnostic. She'd returned home to Thaddeus and tried to pretend nothing had changed. But she'd started noticing the lesbian couples she saw at the grocery store, the pride flags in Cleveland Heights windows, the way some women looked at each other with a hunger she recognized because she'd never felt it with her husband. She'd started researching in secret, late at night, when Thaddeus worked in his study. She'd read articles about late-blooming lesbians, women who'd spent decades in heterosexual marriages before finally acknowledging the truth. She'd found online communities where women shared stories that sounded eerily like her own. And then, in a moment of desperation and longing, she'd created a profile on sapphiconnections.com. It started with small things Thaddeus couldn't quite name. The way Diane had begun dressing differently, less of the conservative skirt suits she'd always favored, more of a casual elegance that involved fitted blazers and slim-cut pants. The way she'd cut her hair shorter, into a tapered style that emphasized the elegant column of her neck. The way she'd started going to the gym 5 days a week, coming home flushed and energized in a way he hadn't seen in years. "You look good," he'd said one morning in early November, watching her button a crisp white shirt. "Thanks," she'd replied. But there was something guarded in her smile, as if his compliment was an intrusion rather than a kindness. She'd started spending more time on her laptop, closing windows quickly when he entered the room. She'd changed her phone passcode, something they'd never bothered with in 18 years of marriage. She'd begun taking calls in other rooms, her voice low and careful, laughter occasionally drifting through the walls in a register he didn't recognize. When he asked who she was talking to, she'd say, "Just Patricia from work," or "A friend from the conference," her tone casual, but her eyes not quite meeting his. Their sex life, already sporadic, had evaporated entirely. When he reached for her in bed, she'd claim exhaustion, a headache, the need for sleep before an early meeting. Her body, when he managed to embrace her, felt rigid, enduring rather than engaging. Thaddeus told himself it was stress from work. Diane's job was brutal. She dealt daily with children removed from horrific situations, parents who failed spectacularly, a system perpetually underfunded and overwhelmed. He told himself she needed space, that pushing would only drive her further away. But late at night, lying awake while she slept facing the wall, he felt a cold dread settling in his bones. Something was wrong. Something fundamental had shifted, and he didn't know how to ask about it without sounding paranoid or insecure. In early December, he'd come home early from a conference that ended ahead of schedule. He'd let himself in quietly, planning to surprise Diane with takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant. But as he climbed the stairs, he heard her voice from their bedroom, talking on the phone. I know," she was saying, her voice carrying a warmth he rarely heard anymore. "It's just complicated. I'm not sure how to—" "No, he doesn't know. How could I even begin to explain?" A pause, then a laugh, intimate, conspiratorial. "You make it sound so simple." Thaddeus had frozen on the landing, his heart hammering against his ribs. Who was she talking to? What didn't he know? He'd cleared his throat loudly and continued up the stairs. By the time he reached the bedroom doorway, Diane was off the phone, her expression neutral. "You're home early," she said. "Conference wrapped up. I brought Thai food." "That's sweet. I'm actually not that hungry." They'd eaten in near silence, Diane picking at her pad Thai while scrolling through her phone. Thaddeus watched her across the table and realized he was looking at a stranger. The next day, driven by something he couldn't quite name, not suspicion, not yet, but a sick certainty that his marriage was ending, and he didn't know why. Thaddeus had done something he'd never done before. He'd checked the browser history on the laptop they shared, the one Diane usually used for work. She'd cleared it. Every single page, meticulously erased. That night, he'd lain awake until he heard her breathing settle into sleep, then carefully extracted himself from bed. He'd gone downstairs to his study, opened his own laptop, and done something that made him feel dirty even as he did it. He'd logged into their cell phone account and pulled her text message records. The numbers meant nothing to him, just digits. But the frequency told a story. Dozens of texts daily to the same number, concentrated in the evenings and early mornings. Hundreds over the past month alone. Who was she talking to? And why the secrecy? Thaddeus spent the following days in a fugue state, presiding over cases while his mind churned through possibilities. An affair seemed obvious, but something about that didn't fit. Diane wasn't acting like someone caught in the throes of passion. She was acting like someone preparing for something, building a secret life, brick by careful brick. He considered hiring a private investigator, but recoiled from the idea. He was a judge, for God's sake. He dealt in evidence and due process. He couldn't stalk his own wife like some jealous character in a bad movie. But the not knowing was corrosive. It ate at him during morning coffee, during lunch recess, during evening news. He snapped at his clerk over a minor filing error. He gave a defense attorney a dressing down that was more personal than professional. He felt himself coming apart, and he hated himself for it even as it was happening. On December 10th, a Thursday, everything changed. Diane had told him she was working late on year-end reports. Thaddeus had nodded, poured himself a bourbon, and settled into his study to review briefs for the next day's docket. But he couldn't concentrate. The words on the page swam meaninglessly. After an hour of pretending to work, he'd done something he would later recognize as the beginning of the end. He'd opened Diane's laptop. It wasn't password protected. She'd never bothered, trusting him implicitly. The irony would later strike him as almost funny. He'd opened her browser, typed a random letter in the search bar to see what autocomplete suggested. The first suggestion made his blood freeze. SapphiccConnections.com log in. His hands had trembled as he navigated to the site. A lesbian dating website. His wife had been visiting a lesbian dating website. He'd sat there for 10 full minutes, staring at the homepage with its rainbow imagery and testimonials from happy couples. Women seeking women. Community and connection. Be your authentic self. Then, operating on some autopilot of masochism, he'd clicked on the profiles page. The site allowed browsing without logging in, and it took him less than 2 minutes to find her. There she was. D, 45, Cleveland Heights. The photo was recent, from their trip to Chicago last spring, her smile unguarded, in a way it never was at home anymore. The bio was brief, but devastating. Recently awakening to my truth after years of living for others. Seeking genuine connection with women who understand the courage it takes to become yourself. Interested in conversation, friendship, and seeing where things lead. No judgments, no pressure, just honesty. Thaddeus had read it 3 times, each reading making less sense than the last. His wife was gay? Had been gay? Was becoming gay? How did that even work? They'd been married for 18 years. They'd made love, not recently, but they had. They'd tried to have children. How could this be real? The rage came slowly at first, then all at once, a white-hot tsunami of betrayal and humiliation that left him shaking. She'd made a fool of him. 18 years of his life, built on a lie. Everyone would know. His colleagues, his friends, the community that respected him. He'd become a punchline. The judge who couldn't even recognize his wife was gay. He'd stalked to the desk drawer where he kept his service revolver, the Glock 19 he'd owned since his prosecutor days. He'd taken it out, felt its familiar weight, and for a long, terrible moment, he'd imagined using it. The house was silent except for the rain. Thaddeus sat in his study, the laptop screen still glowing with his wife's profile, the gun heavy in his hands. His mind raced through scenarios, each more terrible than the last. He imagined Diane with another woman, their hands entwined, their bodies pressed together in ways that made his stomach revolt. He imagined his colleagues finding out, the whispers in courthouse corridors, the knowing looks. Poor Thaddeus didn't even know his own wife. The humiliation was almost worse than the betrayal. Almost. He heard the front door open. Diane's voice called out, "Thaddeus, I'm home." He didn't respond. Couldn't. His throat had closed around words too terrible to speak. Her footsteps on the stairs, slow and tired. She appeared in the study doorway, still in her work clothes, hair damp from the rain. She looked beautiful in a way that made him want to scream. "Hey, sorry I'm so late. The budget meeting ran over and—" She stopped, noticing the laptop, the angle of the screen. Her eyes went wide, and Thaddeus watched her face cycle through emotions in real time. Recognition, fear, Resignation. "Thaddeus," she said softly. "That's not. I can explain." "You can explain?" His voice came out strangled. "You can explain that you're trolling lesbian dating sites while we're married? That you've been living a lie for 18 years? It's not like that." She took a step into the room, hands raised as if approaching a wild animal. "Please, just let me—" "How long?" he demanded. "How long have you known?" Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Known? Thaddeus, I don't even know what I know. I'm confused and scared, and trying to figure out who I am after spending my whole life being who everyone else needed me to be. So this is my fault?" He stood, the gun still in his hand, though he wasn't consciously holding it as a threat. "Not yet." "I made you gay?" "No one made me anything," her voice cracked. "Do you think I chose this? Do you think I wanted to wake up at 45 and realize everything I thought I knew about myself might be wrong? Then why the secrecy? Why not just tell me?" He was shouting now, all the careful control he'd spent a lifetime cultivating, burned away by betrayal. "Why make me look like a fool?" "Because I was terrified," Diane shouted back, tears streaming down her face. "Because I grew up in a church that told me people like me were going to hell. Because my mother would rather I die than be gay. Because I love you, Thaddeus, and I didn't want to hurt you. But I'm suffocating, and I can't keep pretending anymore." The confession hung in the air between them, too large and too devastating to process. Thaddeus felt something in his chest crack clean through, as if his heart had physically broken. "You love me," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "But you're gay." "I don't know what I am." Diane pressed her palms to her eyes. "Maybe I'm bisexual. Maybe I've been in denial my whole life. Maybe I'm just broken. All I know is that I look at my life, and I feel like I'm drowning, and I needed to figure out why." Thaddeus looked at the gun in his hand, suddenly conscious of its weight. He saw Diane's eyes follow his gaze, saw her face go pale. "Thaddeus," she said carefully, "please put that down. Did you sleep with someone?" He needed to know, needed to understand the full scope of the betrayal. "Have you been cheating on me?" "No," she said it firmly, meeting his eyes. "I swear to God, no. I created that profile to talk to people who might understand what I'm going through. That's all. I've never met anyone from the site. I've never cheated on you." He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her. But trust, once shattered, doesn't reassemble cleanly. "Get out," he said. "What?" "Get out of this house. Now! Tonight! Thaddeus, please! We need to talk about this!" "There's nothing to talk about!" The roar tore from his throat, primal and anguished. "You destroyed our marriage. You made me a laughingstock. You wasted 18 years of my life." "I wasted them?" Diane's grief transformed into anger. "You think I haven't suffered? You think those miscarriages didn't destroy me? You think I haven't spent every day of our marriage feeling like I was failing at being a woman, a wife, a mother? You think I wanted to discover at 45 that the reason I felt wrong my entire life is because I've been forcing myself to be something I'm not? So I'm just collateral damage in your journey of self-discovery? That's not fair. None of this is fair." He slammed his hand on the desk, making them both jump. "You don't get to play victim when you're the one who lied, when you're the one who broke every vow we made." Diane wiped her eyes, her expression hardening into something Thaddeus had never seen before, a cold resolve that made her seem like a stranger. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'll go. I'll stay at Patricia's tonight. But Thaddeus, I need you to understand something. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did this because I was dying inside, and I needed to find out if there was a version of me that could actually breathe." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "And Thaddeus, that gun in your hand, the fact that you took it out when you found my profile, that tells me everything about how you really see this. Not as my crisis, but as your humiliation. Not about my pain, but about your reputation." She left. He heard her moving through the bedroom, drawers opening and closing. 20 minutes later, the front door shut with devastating finality. Thaddeus stood alone in his study, the rain still hammering against windows, the gun still in his hand, and the laptop screen still glowing with the profile of a woman he thought he'd known. And in the terrible silence that followed, something in Thaddeus Wellington broke beyond repair. Thaddeus didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study until dawn, the bourbon bottle empty beside him. The gun returned to its drawer, but still singing its siren song. As pale light filtered through the windows, he made a decision. He would understand this. All of it. He would investigate his wife the way he would investigate any case, gather evidence, establish a timeline, understand motives and means and opportunity. He called in sick to court, the first time in 12 years, and began his investigation in earnest. He started with her laptop, going through every file, every document, every saved web page. What he found wasn't evidence of an affair, but something more complex. A digital trail of someone trying to understand herself. Downloaded books about late-blooming lesbianism. Saved articles about compulsory heterosexuality. Forum posts where women shared stories of leaving marriages after decades of denial. One post in particular stopped him cold. It was from a user called D in Ohio, and while it was anonymous, he recognized his wife's voice. "I'm 45 years old. I've been married to a good man for almost 2 decades. He's never been cruel or unfaithful. He's accomplished and respected. On paper, I have everything I was supposed to want. So why do I feel like I'm living someone else's life? Why do I look at my wedding photos and feel like I'm looking at a stranger? Why does the thought of spending the next 30 years like this make me want to scream? I know I'm hurting him by questioning this, but I'm also hurting myself by not questioning it. What do you do when the truth and kindness are incompatible?" Thaddeus read it 3 times, feeling something unexpected, not just anger, but a terrible, aching sympathy. He tried to imagine what it would be like to wake up one day and realize your entire identity was constructed on a foundation of denial and social expectation. He tried to imagine the courage it would take to admit that to yourself, let alone to anyone else. Then he remembered the humiliation, the betrayal, and the sympathy curdled back into rage. He accessed her email next, justifying the invasion by telling himself that truth mattered more than privacy. What he found there made him pause. Dozens of messages between Diane and someone named Angela Morrison, the woman from the Columbus conference. The messages were intimate, but not sexual. They discussed books, identity, fear, hope. Angela shared her own story of coming out in her 30s, losing friends and family but gaining herself. Diane asked questions, sought reassurance, confessed fears. "I'm terrified of losing everything," Diane had written in one message. "My family, my marriage, my standing in the community. Everyone will see me differently. But I'm also terrified of never knowing who I really am. Of dying one day, having never been authentic. Which fear should win?" Angela's response had been gentle but firm. "Neither fear should win, Dee. What should win is your courage to face the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be. And for what it's worth, you're already losing yourself by staying in denial. The only question is whether you'll keep losing pieces until there's nothing left, or whether you'll risk everything to become whole." Thaddeus closed the laptop, feeling sick. This wasn't a simple story of betrayal. This was a tragedy of 2 people who'd loved each other, but had built their marriage on incompatible foundations neither of them had recognized until it was too late. Over the next 3 days, Thaddeus became obsessed. He drove past Patricia's apartment building at odd hours, watching for Diane's car. He created a fake profile on Sapphic Connections to see if she was still active. She wasn't. He called their friends under pretenses, trying to gauge if anyone knew, if anyone had suspected. No one had. To the world, they were still the model couple, which meant the humiliation was still private, still containable, still something he could control if he acted quickly enough. On the fourth day, he received an email from Diane. The subject line read, "We need to talk. Please." The message was brief. "Thaddeus, I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But we need to have an actual conversation about what happens next. Can we meet somewhere neutral? A coffee shop, maybe? I think we owe each other that much." He stared at the email for an hour before responding. Saturday, 2 p.m., Phoenix Coffee on Lee Road. Don't bring anyone? Her response came immediately. "I'll be there, thank you." The days until Saturday crawled by with excruciating slowness. Thaddeus prepared for the meeting the way he prepared for court, gathering evidence, planning arguments, anticipating objections. He would be calm, controlled, reasonable. He would get answers. He would understand. But understanding, he would soon discover, was far more dangerous than ignorance. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of December day that made Cleveland feel like the edge of the world. Thaddeus arrived at Phoenix Coffee 15 minutes early, positioning himself at a corner table where he could see the door. He dressed carefully, a tailored sweater and slacks, nothing too formal but nothing casual either. He needed to project control, competence, the kind of man who couldn't be destroyed by his wife's crisis. Diane arrived exactly at 2, wearing jeans and a leather jacket he'd never seen before. She looked smaller somehow, as if the confession had physically diminished her, or maybe it was him who had grown monstrous with rage. She sat down across from him, ordered a black coffee from the barista, and waited. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I've been thinking about Stoic philosophy," Thaddeus said finally, his voice measured. Thaddeus Aurelius wrote that we can't control what happens to us, only how we respond, that the obstacle becomes the way. Diane looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Is that what I am to you now? An obstacle?" "I'm trying to make sense of this rationally," he continued, ignoring her question. The Stoics believed that destructive emotions, anger, grief, fear, arise from false judgments about what's good and bad. They taught that wisdom comes from accepting reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. "So you're philosophizing your way out of feeling. I'm trying to respond to this crisis with discipline instead of chaos." He leaned forward. "Here's what I've concluded. You've been lying to me for 18 years. Whether intentionally or through self-deception doesn't matter. The result is the same. Our marriage was built on a false foundation. The rational response is to dissolve it cleanly and move forward." Diane flinched. "That's it? 18 years? And you're ready to just walk away? What choice do I have?" His voice remained calm, but something cold was crystallizing in his chest, a hardness he'd never felt before. "You're gay, Diane, or questioning, or whatever word makes you comfortable. The fact remains, you don't want to be married to a man. Probably never did." "That's not—" She stopped, closed her eyes. "I don't know what I want. I know I loved you when we married. I know I still care about you. But I also know something in me has always been wrong, and I can't keep ignoring it. So I'm supposed to what? Wait around while you figure yourself out? Be your beard while you explore your sexuality? Let you humiliate me publicly when this inevitably becomes gossip? I would never humiliate you. You already have." His voice dropped lower, colder. "Every moment you were lying to me, to yourself, about who you really are. That was humiliation. Every time we made love and you were probably imagining someone else, that was humiliation. Every dinner party where colleagues congratulated us on our marriage while you secretly planned to blow it up, That was humiliation. Tears streamed down Diane's face. I never imagined anyone else. I never planned to blow anything up. I was just trying to survive, Thaddeus. Survive what? A marriage to a man who loved you, who gave you everything. A life I never chose. Her voice cracked. You think I chose to be attracted to women? You think I chose to grow up in a culture that told me I was an abomination? You think I chose to spend 45 years hating myself for feelings I couldn't control? But you did choose to marry me knowing something was wrong. I didn't know. She slammed her hand on the table, drawing looks from other patrons. I didn't know what I was feeling was attraction to women, because I'd spent my entire life suppressing it. I thought something was broken in me, because I couldn't feel what my friends felt about their husbands. I thought I was just damaged from the miscarriages, or depressed, or emotionally stunted. It never occurred to me that I might be gay, because I'd been taught my whole life that gay wasn't a possibility. It was something that happened to other people, broken people, sinful people, not me. Thaddeus sat back, something shifting in his understanding. He thought of his own father, working double shifts to pay for his education, dying before seeing his son's success. He thought about sacrifice and duty and the ways people imprisoned themselves in roles they never chose. For a brief moment, he saw Diane not as his betrayer, but as someone trapped in a prison of expectation, trying desperately to breathe. Then he remembered the profile on Sapphic Connections, the secret phone calls, the lies by omission, and the hardness returned. I understand you're struggling, he said slowly. But that doesn't absolve you of responsibility for the damage you've caused. The Stoics taught that we all face difficulties, but character is revealed in how we handle them. You could have come to me earlier, been honest, fought for our marriage or ended it cleanly. Instead, you chose deception. Because I was terrified, because I didn't have the language to explain what was happening to me, because... She stopped, wiping her eyes. You know what? You're right. I should have been braver. I should have trusted you enough to tell you when I first started questioning. But I didn't, and I can't change that. So what now? Thaddeus had thought he wanted answers, but sitting across from his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, he realized what he actually wanted was for the pain to stop. And the only way he could see to make it stop was to end everything cleanly, completely, irrevocably. We file for divorce, he said, quietly, citing irreconcilable differences. We divide assets equitably. We maintain professional respect in public. We move on. That's it? 23 years, and that's it? What else is there? Diane studied him for a long moment, and Thaddeus saw something in her eyes that looked like pity. It enraged him more than anything else had. The man I married had compassion, she said softly. He understood that people were complex, that justice wasn't always simple. What happened to him? He discovered his wife was living a lie, Thaddeus said coldly. And he learned that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is let go. He stood, leaving money on the table for both coffees, and walked out into the December cold. Behind him, he heard Diane crying, but he didn't turn back. The transformation was complete. Judge Thaddeus Wellington, who'd spent his life believing in redemption and second chances, had become something harder, a man who would rather destroy than be destroyed. The days after their meeting stretched into weeks, each one carrying Thaddeus deeper into a darkness he barely recognized. Christmas came and went without celebration. He worked through New Year's Eve, reviewing briefs in his empty house, while the neighborhood shot off fireworks that sounded like gunfire. Diane had moved out completely, taking only clothes and personal items, leaving everything else untouched. The house felt like a museum to a marriage that had never really existed. He'd walk through rooms and see ghosts. Diane laughing at something on TV, Diane cooking Sunday dinner, Diane crying after the last miscarriage, while he held her and promised everything would be okay. Except nothing had been okay. Maybe nothing had ever been okay. He filed the divorce papers in early January, citing irreconcilable differences. He used a discreet attorney, ensured everything was sealed, did everything possible to keep their private tragedy from becoming public knowledge. Diane didn't contest anything. She signed the papers without comment. And just like that, 18 years dissolved into legal documentation. But dissolution, Thaddeus discovered, was only the beginning. The rage he thought he'd controlled through stoic discipline hadn't disappeared. It had merely gone underground, festering in the dark spaces between his thoughts. He'd wake at 3 in the morning with his heart racing, imagining Diane with another woman, imagining his colleagues laughing at him, imagining his father's disappointment from beyond the grave. "You let a woman make a fool of you," the phantom voice would whisper. "All your accomplishments mean nothing if you can't even keep your wife." He started drinking more heavily. Not enough to affect his work, never that, but enough that most nights ended with bourbon and silence. He grew thinner, sharper-edged, his temper in court becoming legendary. Defense attorneys began requesting different judges. His clerk started handling him with the careful delicacy reserved for explosives. In early February, he ran into Patricia at a judicial conference. She was alone at the hotel bar, and he'd approached her with bourbon courage and questions he'd been afraid to ask. "How is she?" he'd said, sliding onto the bar stool next to her. Patricia had looked at him warily. "Thaddeus, I don't think... Please. I just need to know she's okay." Patricia had sighed, ordered another drink, and said, "She's surviving. Barely. She blames herself for everything. She's seeing a therapist, trying to figure out who she is now that she's not your wife." "Is she seeing anyone?" "No. She's not ready for that. She might never be ready. Turns out blowing up your life doesn't automatically lead to happiness." Thaddeus had nodded, feeling something twist in his chest. "Did you know? Before? That she was gay?" "No. That something was wrong between you two, yes. Anyone who paid attention could see she was drowning, Thaddeus. And you were too busy being perfect to notice." The accusation had stung because it was true. He'd been so focused on his career, his reputation, his image of what their marriage should be, that he'd never stopped to ask if Diane was actually happy. "She should have told me," he'd said. "Probably. But you should have asked." He'd left the conference early, drove home through a blizzard, and did something he immediately regretted. He logged into Sapphic Connections with the fake profile he'd created weeks ago. Diane's profile was gone. But in the deleted user archive, accessible through a paid subscription he purchased with shaking hands, he found her message history. She'd been talking to several women, but the conversations were all the same. Tentative, questioning, scared. She'd never arranged to meet anyone. She'd never exchanged phone numbers. She'd simply been reaching out for understanding from people who might not judge her. The last message she'd sent, dated 3 days before Thaddeus had discovered her profile, stopped his heart. "I think I have to tell my husband the truth. I've been living a lie for so long I don't know who I am anymore. He doesn't deserve this. He's a good man, and I'm destroying him by staying silent. I'm so scared. But I think honesty, even devastating honesty, is kinder than continuing to live this way. Thank you all for helping me find the courage." Thaddeus stared at the message for an hour. She'd been planning to tell him. She'd found the courage, was about to confess, and then he'd discovered the profile and exploded their marriage in the worst possible way. The revelation should have brought relief, proof that she'd never intended permanent deception. Instead, it brought something worse, the terrible knowledge that he'd destroyed any chance for honest conversation, for working through this together, for possibly finding a way forward that honored both their truths. He'd acted like the men he sentenced from the bench, men who let rage override reason, who prioritized their wounded pride over everything else, who destroyed what they claimed to love rather than face their own inadequacy. The next morning, he'd called Diane. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice guarded. "Thaddeus, I need to see you." "Why?" "Because I was wrong about everything." A long pause. Then, "It's too late for that. Please, Diane, one more conversation. That's all I'm asking." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, but not at the house. Somewhere public. Tomorrow at 3, Shaker Square." He'd agreed, hung up, and spent the next 24 hours planning what he would say, how he would apologize, how he would try to make her understand that he'd been acting from pain rather than wisdom. But when tomorrow came, everything would go horribly, irreversibly wrong. The square was bitter cold, the fountain frozen solid, the benches empty except for a few hardy souls hurrying through the February wind. Thaddeus arrived early again, this time not out of tactical advantage, but genuine desperation. He'd worn the coat Diane had bought him for their 10th anniversary, hoping she'd notice, hoping it would remind her of better times. She arrived exactly on time, bundled in a heavy parka, her natural hair covered by a knit cap. She looked exhausted, older, as if the last 2 months had aged her years. They sat on a bench facing the fountain, both of them staring ahead rather than at each other. "I read your messages," Thaddeus said without preamble. "On the dating site. I saw that you were going to tell me." Diane turned to look at him, shocked. "You hacked my account?" "I paid for access to deleted profiles. I needed to understand." "So you're still investigating me like I'm a criminal?" "No." He finally met her eyes. "I'm trying to understand how badly I failed you, how my pride and my fear turned me into someone I don't recognize." She shook her head slowly. "Thaddeus, what do you want from me? We're divorced. The papers are signed. What's left to say?" "That I'm sorry. That I should have responded with compassion instead of rage. That you deserved better from me. We both deserved better." Her voice was flat, exhausted. "But sorry doesn't change anything. We can't go back." "I don't want to go back," he said carefully. "I want to go forward, differently. Maybe we can't be married, but we could be. I don't know. Friends? Eventually." Diane laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "You think I can be friends with the man who looked at me like I was disgusting? Who made me feel like a monster for trying to figure out who I am? I never thought you were disgusting. Your face said differently when you found that profile, Thaddeus. The look you gave me, I'll never forget it. Pure revulsion." He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. She was right. In that moment of discovery, he'd seen her not as his wife struggling with impossible questions, but as a threat to everything he'd built. "What do you want me to say?" he asked finally. "That I was perfect? I wasn't. I failed you in 100 ways before you ever created that profile. I was so focused on our public image, on being the perfect couple, that I never asked if you were actually happy. I let you suffer through 3 miscarriages while I processed it all through work. I turned our marriage into a performance." "You did," she agreed quietly. "But I failed too. I should have been honest earlier, before things got this bad. I should have trusted you with my confusion. We both made mistakes, Thaddeus. That doesn't mean we can fix them." They sat in silence for a long moment, the wind cutting through their coats, turning their breath to frost. "Angela Morrison," Thaddeus said finally. "The woman you've been emailing. Are you? Is she?" "We're friends," Diane said firmly. "That's all. She's married, Thaddeus, happily. She's been a mentor, helping me understand what I'm going through. Nothing inappropriate has happened." "Do you wish it had?" Diane stood abruptly. "I don't know why I agreed to meet you. This isn't helping either of us." Thaddeus stood too, reaching for her arm. "Please, just tell me one thing. Did you ever really love me? Was any of it real? She turned to face him fully, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. Of course it was real. I loved you, Thaddeus. I still love you in some ways. But love isn't always enough. I can love you and still need to leave. I can care about you and still know that staying would destroy us both. That's what you don't understand. This isn't about you being inadequate or me not loving you enough. It's about me finally being honest about who I am, even if that honesty breaks both our hearts. So what now? His voice cracked. We just move on. Pretend 18 years meant nothing. They meant everything, Diane said, tears freezing on her cheeks. But they're over, and we both need to accept that. She started to walk away, and Thaddeus felt something in him snap, not into rage this time, but into a desperate, clawing need to not let her go, to not let this end, to somehow stop time and force them back into a version of their life where none of this had happened. I could forgive you, he called out, if you wanted to try again. I could learn to accept. She spun around, fury replacing grief. Accept what, Thaddeus? My being gay? My identity isn't something you get to magnanimously tolerate. I'm not a problem for you to solve or a flaw for you to overlook. I'm a person trying to live authentically for the first time in my entire life, and I don't need your forgiveness for that. But we could— No! She was shouting now, all the careful control shattered. We're done. We've been done for years. We just didn't know it. You want to know the truth? The complete, devastating truth? I'm relieved. I'm relieved it's over. I'm relieved I don't have to pretend anymore. I'm relieved I don't have to force myself to feel something I don't feel, be something I'm not. Live a lie for the sake of your pride and my family's expectations. So you can keep your forgiveness, Thaddeus. I don't want it. I don't need it. I just need you to let me go. The words hit him like physical blows. He stood frozen, watching her walk away through the snow, and something in him understood. This was really the end. There would be no reconciliation, no friendship, no gradual healing. There would only be absence where she had been. And in that moment of absolute clarity, something ancient and terrible whispered in his mind. If I can't have her, if this is really over, then at least I can make her hurt the way she hurt me. He went home, poured a bourbon, and made the worst decision of his life. The story Thaddeus released to the press 3 days later was carefully crafted. He didn't mention the Lesbian website directly. That would have seemed vindictive. Instead, he told a tale of betrayal, of a wife who'd been carrying on an emotional affair, of his discovery and devastation. He positioned himself as the wounded party, the good man betrayed by a wife exploring other options. The black media in Cleveland picked it up immediately. The Call-and-Post ran a sympathetic profile. A local radio show had him on to discuss modern marriage and infidelity in the black community. He was offered a book deal to write about recovering from betrayal. And just like that, Diane became the villain in their story. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Her colleagues at the foster care agency began treating her differently. Parents in custody cases started requesting she be removed from their files. Her church, the church she'd attended since childhood, asked her to step down from the board. Her mother stopped taking her calls. Within 2 weeks, Diane had lost almost everything except her job, and even that hung by a thread. Thaddeus told himself he'd simply told his truth, that he'd had a right to his own narrative. But late at night, in the bottom of his bourbon glass, he knew better. He'd weaponized the story to punish her, to make her suffer the way he was suffering, to ensure that, if he couldn't have her, at least she'd pay for leaving him. On February 27th, Patricia called him at midnight. He was already drunk, had been drunk for days, and he answered with slurred caution. "What did you do?" Patricia demanded, her voice shaking with fury. "What?" "Diane's in the hospital, Thaddeus. She tried to kill herself." The world stopped. Everything, his breath, his heart, time itself, simply stopped. "What?" he managed finally. "Pills. A lot of pills. Her neighbor found her and called 911. They pumped her stomach. She's alive, but barely. And it's your fault." "No, I didn't. I just told my story. You destroyed her." Patricia was crying now. "You knew how fragile she was. You knew she was already falling apart. And you went public with your version, turned her into a pariah, stripped away everything she had left. You did this deliberately, Thaddeus. You broke her because she broke you first." He hung up, stumbled to the bathroom, and vomited until there was nothing left. Then he sat on the cold tile floor and finally understood what he'd become. He'd turned into the men he sentenced, the men who couldn't handle rejection, who punished women for leaving, who chose destruction over acceptance. He'd let his wounded pride override every principle he claimed to hold dear. He'd become a monster. 3 days later, after Diane was released from psychiatric hold, Thaddeus drove to Patricia's apartment. Diane answered the door, pale and hollow-eyed, and they stood there for a long moment, looking at each other across an unbridgeable chasm. "I'm sorry," Thaddeus said, the words inadequate and too late. "I'm so desperately sorry. I tried to destroy you because you destroyed the image I had of us, and I couldn't. I didn't know how else to process the pain. But what I did was unforgivable. I know that. I just needed you to hear me say it." Diane looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no residual love, nothing but exhausted distance. "The judge I married believed in justice," she said quietly. "Not revenge. But I guess I never really knew him either." She closed the door. Thaddeus went home and did the only thing left to do. He resigned from the bench. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "I can no longer, in good conscience, sit in judgment of others when I have so spectacularly failed to judge my own actions with wisdom or compassion. I have let personal pain override professional ethics. I am not fit to serve." The resignation made headlines. His OWA colleagues called it an overreaction. His friends begged him to reconsider. But Thaddeus knew better. Some stains don't wash out. Some damage can't be undone. Some transformations are permanent. 6 months later, Thaddeus sat in his father's study, the room in the house he'd grown up in, which his mother had kept exactly as it was the day his father died. She'd recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and moved to assisted living, and the task of clearing out the house had fallen to Thaddeus. He'd found his father's old journals, the ones he'd written while working double shifts at the mill. Entry after entry about sacrifice, about doing what was necessary, about providing for family even when it meant giving up dreams. And near the end, an entry dated 1 week before his father's death. Thaddeus called today from Yale. He sounded tired but happy. "He's working so hard, harder than I ever worked, and he'll achieve things I could never imagine. But I worry sometimes that I've taught him the wrong lessons. I've taught him that duty matters more than joy, that achievement matters more than connection, that the world's perception matters more than internal truth. I hope he learns what I'm learning now, at 53, that none of it matters if you lose yourself in the performance. I hope he learns to be kinder to himself and to others than I ever was. I hope he learns that love, real, messy, complicated love, matters more than respect or reputation or any of the things we tell ourselves we're working for." Thaddeus read it 3 times, tears streaming down his face. His father had known, had tried in his own way to warn him. But Thaddeus had been too busy becoming successful to learn how to be human. He thought about Diane, about the life they'd built and destroyed. He thought about how he'd let his father's ghost drive him toward achievement at the expense of everything else. He thought about how he'd turned into a man who punished honesty, who weaponized pain, who chose revenge over grace. He'd failed Diane. He'd failed himself. He'd failed every principle he claimed to uphold. But failure, he was learning, didn't have to be final. It could be educational. It could be the beginning of actual wisdom rather than its performance. Thaddeus spent the next year in therapy, working through layers of pain and pride and the toxic masculinity that had taught him. Wounded pride was more important than compassion. He sold the Tudor revival, couldn't stand to be in the house anymore, and moved to a modest apartment in Little Italy. He started teaching criminal justice at Cleveland State, working with students who reminded him why he'd gone into law in the first place, to help, not to punish. He never tried to contact Diane again. That door was closed, and it needed to stay closed. But he sent a letter to Patricia asking her to pass along a message. Tell her I'm learning. Tell her I'm trying to become the person I should have been when she needed me. Tell her I understand now that her honesty was an act of courage, not betrayal. And tell her I'm sorry. Every day, I'm sorry. He never heard back, and he didn't expect to. Some apologies don't earn forgiveness. Some wounds don't heal. Some relationships end, and all you can do is learn from the wreckage. Late at night sometimes, Thaddeus would think about the man he'd been, the judge who'd sat on the bench dispensing justice while being utterly unjust in his own life. He'd think about the gun in his desk drawer, how close he'd come to doing something even more irreversible than destroying his wife's reputation. He'd think about how easily love could curdle into hate when mixed with wounded pride. And he'd think about Diane, hoping she'd found whatever she was looking for, hoping she'd discovered how to breathe freely in a life that was truly her own. He'd never know if she had. That was part of his penance. But he hoped. God, he hoped. Because in the end, that was all he had left. Hope that she was better without him. Hope that his destruction had at least freed her. Hope that somewhere in the wreckage of their marriage, she'd found the authentic life she'd always deserved. It wasn't redemption. It might never be redemption. But it was a beginning. The slow, painful beginning of becoming human again. So what would you do? If you discovered your spouse of nearly 2 decades was questioning their sexuality, had created a secret profile seeking connection, had been living with doubts they couldn't voice, how would you respond? Would you react with rage or compassion? Would you prioritize your wounded pride or their desperate struggle for authenticity? And here's the harder question. If you'd acted the way Thaddeus did, if you'd let your pain become a weapon, if you'd weaponized someone's vulnerability because they'd wounded you first, could you forgive yourself? Should you? The truth is, most of us would like to think we'd be noble in this situation, that we'd respond with wisdom and compassion. But when you're drowning in betrayal, when your entire identity is collapsing, when the story you've told yourself about your life turns out to be fiction, nobility is harder than we imagine. What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you have responded differently than Thaddeus? Could you empathize with Diane's impossible position? Is forgiveness possible after this level of mutual destruction? And most importantly, how do we learn to be kinder to each other when life shatters the stories we thought were true? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the messy, complicated reality of human relationships. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't have easy answers. They just have truth, as painful and complicated as it is.